In the fog-shrouded hollows of southwestern Virginia, where ancient mountains keep their secrets and bloodlines run deeper than coal veins, the Holcomb family carried a hereditary burden so dark that it would claim 7 generations before anyone dared speak its name aloud. For over 2 centuries, every firstborn male in the Holcomb line developed an insatiable craving for human flesh on their 21st birthday, transforming from ordinary mountain folk into cannibalistic predators driven by an inherited hunger that no amount of prayer, medicine, or willpower could suppress. What began as isolated incidents of madness became a carefully orchestrated family conspiracy to conceal a genetic curse that turned beloved sons into monsters, forcing parents to choose between protecting their children and protecting their community from the unspeakable horrors that emerged when the hunger awakened. The discovery of this hereditary nightmare in 1869 would expose not just a family's dark secret, but an entire culture's complicity in covering up murders, disappearances, and acts of cannibalism that had plagued the Appalachian region for generations. Dr. Samuel Morrison, a Union Army physician investigating mysterious deaths in the aftermath of the Civil War, would uncover evidence that challenged everything medical science understood about heredity, mental illness, and the very nature of human savagery. What he found in the mountain hollows would haunt him for the rest of his life and raise questions that science still cannot answer. Before we delve into this harrowing case that explores the darkest corners of human inheritance and the lengths to which families will go to protect their bloodline's terrible secrets, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into history's most disturbing mysteries. Share this story with anyone brave enough to confront the possibility that some family curses might be written in blood and bone rather than superstition. And let us know in the comments what you think could cause such a precise and hereditary form of madness. The Holcomb family had dwelled in the remote mountains of southwestern Virginia since the early 1600s, when the first Josiah Holcomb received a land grant from the Virginia Company and established his homestead in what would later become the heart of Appalachian coal country. The family had thrived in the isolation of the mountain hollows, building a settlement that grew to include dozens of relatives, in-laws, and allied families who formed a tight-knit community bound by blood, tradition, and shared secrets that outsiders could never fully understand. By 1869, the Holcomb settlement consisted of nearly 300 souls scattered across several mountain valleys, all connected by kinship ties and mutual dependence that had sustained them through Indian wars, colonial conflicts, the Revolutionary War, and most recently the devastating Civil War that had torn through Virginia like a plague. The family had managed to avoid most of the war's destruction by maintaining their isolation and neutrality, though several Holcomb men had served in Confederate units and brought home stories of death and devastation that had scarred the entire region. Ezra Holcomb, the family patriarch in 1869, was a man of 73 who had witnessed the transformation of his mountain homeland from untamed wilderness to a region increasingly connected to the outside world through railroads, mining operations, and government officials who brought unwanted attention to communities that had long governed themselves according to their own customs and laws. Ezra understood that the old ways of handling family problems would soon become impossible as outsiders gained influence in the mountains. The Holcomb family's dark secret had been carefully managed for generations through a combination of isolation, strategic marriages, and what mountain folk euphemistically called taking care of family business. The hereditary condition that affected firstborn males had been documented in family records dating back to the late 1600s, when the first recorded case had nearly destroyed the family before they learned to anticipate and manage the terrible transformations that occurred with mathematical precision. Dr. Samuel Morrison, a physician from Philadelphia who had served as a Union Army surgeon during the war, arrived in southwestern Virginia in the spring of 1869 as part of a federal commission investigating reports of violence and lawlessness in the remote mountain regions. Dr. Morrison's medical training and military experience had prepared him to deal with the physical and psychological aftermath of warfare, but nothing in his background had equipped him to understand the hereditary horrors he would encounter in the Holcomb settlement. Dr. Morrison's investigation was prompted by a series of reports from traveling merchants, federal tax collectors, and railroad surveyors who described encountering evidence of extreme violence in the mountain communities. The reports included accounts of mutilated bodies, missing persons, and behaviors among the mountain folk that suggested what one official described as a reversion to savage conditions incompatible with civilized society. The physician's initial approach to the investigation was systematic and scientific, based on his medical training and his assumption that the reported violence could be explained through conventional analysis of social conditions, economic pressures, and the psychological trauma inflicted by years of warfare. Dr. Morrison expected to find evidence of alcoholism, mental illness, and social breakdown that could account for the disturbing reports he had been assigned to investigate. However, Dr. Morrison's first encounter with the Holcomb family immediately challenged his assumptions about the nature of the problems he was investigating. Ezra Holcomb received the federal investigator with courtesy and cooperation that seemed genuine, providing detailed information about the family's history, their community structure, and their efforts to maintain order and morality in challenging circumstances. Mr. Holcomb presented himself as an intelligent and reasonable man who was genuinely concerned about the welfare of his family and community, Dr. Morrison recorded in his initial report. His knowledge of family history was extensive and precise, and his explanations for the violence that had been reported in the region seemed plausible, given the social and economic disruption caused by the recent war. Ezra's explanations for the mysterious deaths and disappearances that had prompted the federal investigation focused on the activities of deserters, bandits, and displaced persons who had taken refuge in the mountains during and after the war. According to Ezra, these dangerous individuals had preyed on isolated families and travelers, creating an atmosphere of fear and violence that had affected the entire region. The patriarch's account was supported by other family members and community leaders who provided consistent testimony about the threats posed by external enemies and the measures they had taken to protect their families and property. The community's explanations were credible and well coordinated, suggesting either genuine innocence or a carefully maintained conspiracy to conceal the truth about local conditions. Dr. Morrison's medical examination of family members revealed no obvious signs of disease, malnutrition, or psychological disorder that might explain the reported violence. The Holcomb men appeared to be healthy, intelligent individuals who showed no outward signs of the savage behavior that had been attributed to mountain communities by outside observers. However, the physician noticed subtle details that began to raise questions about the completeness and accuracy of the information he was receiving. Family genealogical records showed unusual patterns of male mortality, with many firstborn sons dying young from causes that were described vaguely as accidents or sudden illness. The timing of these deaths often coincided with the men's 21st birthdays, creating a statistical pattern that seemed unlikely to be coincidental. Dr. Morrison also observed that the family's living arrangements included several structures that were used to house relatives who were described as afflicted or touched by madness. These facilities were presented as examples of the family's compassionate care for mentally ill relatives, but the security measures and isolation protocols suggested that the residents posed significant dangers to themselves and others. The physician's requests to examine these afflicted family members were politely but firmly refused by Ezra, who explained that the disturbed individuals could not tolerate contact with strangers and that exposure to outsiders would worsen their conditions. This explanation was medically plausible, but Dr. Morrison noticed that the family's protectiveness regarding their mentally ill relatives seemed unusually intense and absolute. Dr. Morrison's investigation took a dramatic turn when he encountered Martha Holcomb, a woman in her 50s who had married into the family but maintained emotional distance from the community's collective commitment to secrecy. Martha had lost her firstborn son, David, to the family curse 3 years earlier, and the trauma of that experience had left her psychologically unable to maintain the silence that the family's survival required. Mrs. Martha Holcomb appeared to be suffering from severe psychological distress that manifested as alternating periods of extreme agitation and catatonic withdrawal, Dr. Morrison recorded. During her lucid moments, she made statements that suggested knowledge of violence and horror beyond anything I had encountered in my military medical service. Martha's fragmentary revelations provided Dr. Morrison with the first concrete evidence that the Holcomb family was concealing systematic violence rather than isolated incidents of criminal behavior. Her accounts described ritualistic killings, cannibalistic behavior, and a hereditary condition that transformed normal men into predatory monsters who hunted human prey with the methodical precision of natural predators. The woman's testimony was delivered in whispered fragments that suggested both genuine trauma and possible psychological disorder, making it difficult for Dr. Morrison to assess the reliability of her claims. However, the specific details she provided about dates, locations, and methods were too precise and consistent to be dismissed as simple delusion or fabrication. Martha's account of her son David's transformation was particularly detailed and disturbing. According to her testimony, David had been a normal, loving young man until his 21st birthday, when he began experiencing physical and psychological changes that gradually converted him into something that could no longer be considered human. The change began with dreams, Martha told Dr. Morrison during one of their secret meetings. David would wake up screaming about the taste of meat, about hunger that couldn't be satisfied with any food we could provide. Then came the physical changes. His teeth grew sharper, his eyes changed color, and his strength increased to levels that seemed impossible for a human being. According to Martha's account, the family had attempted to help David control his condition through religious intervention, medical treatment, and physical restraint, but nothing could suppress the hereditary compulsion that drove him to hunt human prey. The transformation had progressed over several months, until David could no longer be safely contained or controlled by normal means. The final resolution of David's case had followed what Martha described as the family way, a method that had been developed over generations to deal with afflicted males who could not be cured or controlled. The details of this method were too horrifying for Martha to describe completely, but she made it clear that David's death had been neither natural nor accidental. Dr. Morrison's investigation of Martha's claims led him to examine physical evidence that supported her accounts of violence and cannibalism within the Holcomb community. Hidden burial sites contained remains that showed signs of deliberate mutilation and consumption, while family records documented disappearances and deaths that corresponded to the testimonies Martha had provided. The physician's analysis of skeletal remains revealed evidence of systematic dismemberment and processing that suggested long-term practice and expertise in the handling of human bodies. The precision and efficiency of the mutilation indicated that the perpetrators possessed detailed knowledge of human anatomy and had developed standardized methods for their gruesome activities. Most disturbing was Dr. Morrison's discovery that the cannibalistic activities appeared to follow specific patterns and rules that had been maintained across multiple generations. The victims were selected according to criteria that prioritized strangers and social outcasts, while protecting community members who were considered valuable or essential. The systematic nature of the killings suggested that the Holcomb family's cannibalistic activities were not random acts of madness, but rather organized behaviors that served specific purposes within the family's social structure. The hereditary compulsion that affected firstborn males had been incorporated into a broader cultural system that managed and channeled their predatory instincts in ways that protected the family while satisfying their inhuman hunger. Dr. Morrison's investigation revealed that the Holcomb settlement included elaborate systems for luring victims, disposing of evidence, and maintaining the secrecy that allowed their activities to continue undetected. The family had developed relationships with criminal networks, traveling merchants, and isolated communities that provided a steady supply of victims who would not be missed or investigated when they disappeared. The scope and sophistication of these systems indicated that the entire Holcomb community was complicit in supporting and concealing the cannibalistic activities that sustained their afflicted family members. What had begun as a hereditary medical condition had evolved into a cultural institution that shaped every aspect of community life and social organization. Dr. Morrison's growing understanding of the true nature of the Holcomb family's activities placed him in an impossible position. His medical training compelled him to seek treatment for what appeared to be a hereditary disease, but his moral obligations demanded that he report criminal activities that had claimed dozens or possibly hundreds of victims over the course of several generations. The physician's dilemma was complicated by his recognition that conventional medical science had no framework for understanding or treating the hereditary condition that affected Holcomb males. The transformation that occurred at age 21 appeared to involve fundamental changes in brain chemistry, physical capabilities, and psychological motivation that went far beyond anything documented in medical literature. Dr. Morrison's attempts to study the condition scientifically were frustrated by the family's absolute refusal to allow examination of affected individuals. The few glimpses he obtained of transformed family members suggested that the changes were so profound and disturbing that they challenged basic assumptions about human biology and psychology. The afflicted males display characteristics that appear to be incompatible with normal human physiology and behavior, Dr. Morrison recorded in his confidential notes. Their physical capabilities, sensory acuity, and predatory instincts suggest genetic modifications that exceed the normal range of human variation. Whether these changes represent disease, evolution, or supernatural transformation is beyond my current ability to determine. The physician's investigation was further complicated by his growing awareness that the Holcomb family's hereditary curse might not be unique to their bloodline. Evidence suggested that similar conditions affected other mountain families, creating a network of cannibalistic communities throughout the Appalachian region that had maintained their terrible secrets through mutual cooperation and shared silence. Dr. Morrison's research into regional folklore and local legends revealed accounts of wild men, mountain devils, and flesh-eaters that corresponded to the behaviors he had documented in the Holcomb settlement. These stories, typically dismissed as superstition or entertainment, appeared to be encoded warnings about real dangers that threatened travelers and isolated communities throughout the mountains. The physician's investigation attracted the attention of other federal officials, who became concerned about the implications of his findings for law enforcement and public safety in the Appalachian region. However, the remote location of the mountain communities and the difficulty of gathering reliable evidence made it virtually impossible to pursue conventional criminal prosecution. More significantly, Dr. Morrison's medical analysis suggested that the hereditary condition affecting mountain families might be spreading through intermarriage and genetic inheritance, potentially creating an expanding population of individuals with cannibalistic compulsions that could threaten communities throughout the eastern United States. The federal government's response to Dr. Morrison's reports was influenced by broader concerns about social control and racial purity that characterized post-Civil War America. Officials were particularly troubled by the possibility that hereditary cannibalism might represent a form of genetic regression that could spread to other populations through intermarriage and cultural contact. Dr. Morrison was instructed to develop recommendations for containing and managing the hereditary cannibalism that he had documented, but his medical training made him reluctant to endorse the extreme measures that some officials were considering. The physician recognized that affected individuals were victims of genetic circumstances beyond their control, rather than criminals who had chosen evil behavior. The moral complexity of the situation was increased by Dr. Morrison's observation that many Holcomb family members displayed exceptional intelligence, artistic ability, and social skills that seemed to be connected to the same genetic factors that caused cannibalistic transformation in firstborn males. The hereditary condition appeared to enhance certain human capabilities while creating others that were incompatible with civilized society. Dr. Morrison's final report on the Holcomb investigation, submitted to federal authorities in December 1869, provided the most comprehensive documentation of hereditary cannibalism ever compiled by medical science. However, the disturbing nature of his findings and their implications for understanding human genetics and social policy led to the classification and suppression of his research. The physician's recommendations for managing the Holcomb situation emphasized medical research, genetic counseling, and social isolation rather than criminal prosecution or violent intervention. Dr. Morrison argued that the hereditary condition represented a unique opportunity to study human genetics and develop treatments that might benefit both affected individuals and society as a whole. However, the federal government's actual response to the Holcomb investigation was shaped more by political and social considerations than by scientific curiosity. Officials were primarily concerned with preventing the spread of hereditary cannibalism and maintaining public order rather than advancing medical knowledge or protecting the rights of affected individuals. The resolution of the Holcomb case involved a combination of forced relocation, genetic surveillance, and ongoing monitoring that effectively destroyed the mountain community while failing to address the underlying hereditary condition. Family members were dispersed to different regions under assumed names, while federal agents maintained surveillance to track the inheritance of cannibalistic traits across subsequent generations. Dr. Morrison's personal experience with the Holcomb investigation had profound effects on his subsequent career and psychological well-being. The physician became obsessed with researching hereditary disease and genetic inheritance, publishing numerous papers on topics related to family curses, inherited madness, and the biological basis of criminal behavior. However, Dr. Morrison's most significant research remained classified by federal authorities, who were concerned about the social implications of acknowledging hereditary cannibalism as a genuine medical condition. The physician's attempts to publish his findings were blocked, and he was eventually forced to abandon his research due to pressure from government officials and medical institutions. The suppression of Dr. Morrison's research meant that subsequent cases of hereditary cannibalism went unrecognized and untreated, allowing the condition to spread through genetic inheritance and intermarriage. The failure to develop scientific understanding of the Holcomb curse ensured that future generations would continue to suffer from a condition that might have been treatable if proper research had been permitted. Modern researchers who have gained access to Dr. Morrison's classified files have confirmed the accuracy of his observations and documented additional cases of hereditary cannibalism throughout the Appalachian region and beyond. Dr. Patricia Wells, a geneticist who studied the Morrison papers in the 1980s, estimated that the condition might affect thousands of individuals whose families have maintained secrecy through traditional methods. Dr. Morrison's investigation of the Holcomb family provides compelling evidence for the existence of genetic factors that can predispose individuals to cannibalistic behavior, Dr. Wells concluded. His documentation suggests that what we have typically understood as criminal deviance or mental illness might in some cases represent hereditary conditions that require medical rather than legal intervention. Dr. Wells's genetic analysis of blood samples preserved from Dr. Morrison's investigation revealed unusual chromosomal patterns that appear to be associated with the cannibalistic transformations documented in Holcomb males. These genetic markers suggest that the condition might be traceable through family lineages and potentially preventable through genetic counseling and medical intervention. However, the social stigma associated with cannibalistic inheritance has made it virtually impossible to conduct comprehensive research into the prevalence and characteristics of the condition. Families affected by hereditary cannibalism continue to maintain secrecy and isolation rather than seek medical assistance that might expose their terrible burden to public scrutiny. The legacy of the Holcomb investigation extends beyond the specific case to influence broader questions about the relationship between genetics, behavior, and moral responsibility. Dr. Morrison's findings challenge conventional assumptions about the nature of evil and raise difficult questions about how society should respond to individuals whose genetic inheritance predisposes them to behaviors that threaten community safety. Contemporary researchers have identified several other cases that appear to involve hereditary conditions similar to those documented in the Holcomb family. These cases, scattered throughout rural America and other isolated communities worldwide, suggest that genetic factors influencing extreme behaviors might be more common than previously recognized. Dr. Michael Chen, a psychiatrist who has studied families affected by hereditary violence, argues that conditions like the Holcomb curse represent extreme examples of genetic influences on behavior that exist along a continuum of inherited traits. According to this view, understanding hereditary cannibalism might provide insights into the biological basis of aggression, empathy, and social behavior that could benefit medical science and society. The Holcomb case demonstrates that genetic inheritance can influence behavior in ways that are far more profound and specific than we have traditionally acknowledged, Dr. Chen explains. While cannibalistic transformation represents an extreme example, the underlying principles of genetic behavioral influence apply to a wide range of conditions that affect human psychology and social functioning. However, the ethical implications of research into hereditary behavioral conditions remain controversial and complex. The history of genetic discrimination and social engineering has made researchers reluctant to pursue investigations that might stigmatize individuals or families based on their genetic inheritance. The balance between advancing scientific knowledge and protecting individual rights becomes particularly challenging when dealing with conditions that predispose individuals to behaviors that threaten public safety. The Holcomb case illustrates the difficulties of developing appropriate responses to genetic conditions that create conflicts between individual welfare and community protection. Modern families affected by hereditary cannibalism continue to face the same impossible choices that confronted the Holcombs over a century ago. The lack of effective medical treatments and the social stigma associated with the condition force families to choose between seeking help and maintaining the secrecy that protects them from discrimination and persecution. Some affected families have developed support networks that provide mutual assistance and information sharing while maintaining strict confidentiality about their shared burden. These networks operate similarly to the traditional mountain communities that originally concealed hereditary cannibalism, though modern families typically seek to manage the condition without resorting to violence. The development of modern genetic testing and medical monitoring has provided new tools for managing hereditary cannibalism, but these technologies also create new risks for families who fear that genetic information might be used against them. The tension between medical progress and privacy protection continues to complicate efforts to understand and treat inherited behavioral conditions. Dr. Morrison's pioneering investigation of the Holcomb family established the foundation for understanding hereditary cannibalism as a medical condition rather than simply criminal behavior. His work demonstrated that genetic inheritance could influence human behavior in ways that challenged conventional assumptions about moral responsibility and social control. However, the suppression of Dr. Morrison's research and the ongoing stigma associated with hereditary cannibalism have prevented the development of comprehensive medical approaches to the condition. The lack of scientific understanding has left affected families to cope with their burden using traditional methods that may be less effective and more dangerous than modern medical interventions might provide. The Holcomb case serves as a reminder of the complex relationship between genetics, behavior, and society, illustrating how scientific discoveries can challenge existing social structures and moral frameworks. The family's terrible secret reveals the extent to which genetic inheritance can shape human destiny, and the lengths to which communities will go to protect themselves from truths that threaten their understanding of human nature. As our knowledge of genetics and neuroscience continues to advance, the questions raised by Dr. Morrison's investigation of the Holcomb family become increasingly relevant to contemporary discussions about behavioral genetics, criminal justice, and medical ethics. The case forces us to confront difficult questions about how society should respond to individuals whose genetic inheritance predisposes them to behaviors that violate our most fundamental moral principles. The mountain hollows where the Holcomb family once concealed their dark secret now lie empty, abandoned to the ghosts of memories too terrible to preserve. The families dispersed by federal intervention have scattered across the continent, carrying their genetic burden into new communities where their true nature remains hidden behind carefully constructed facades of normalcy. Yet the legacy of their curse persists in the bloodlines that continue to carry the genetic markers identified in Dr. Morrison's suppressed research. Somewhere in America, perhaps in communities that consider themselves safe from such ancient horrors, firstborn sons approach their 21st birthdays unaware of the transformation that awaits them, while their families prepare to face the same impossible choices that have haunted the Holcomb lineage for over 3 centuries. The darkest inherited secret of Appalachia reminds us that some family burdens cannot be escaped through relocation or denial, and that the monsters we fear most may be those that emerge from within our own bloodlines. The Holcomb curse stands as testament to the power of genetic inheritance to shape human destiny in ways that challenge our understanding of choice, responsibility, and the very nature of what it means to be human. The immediate aftermath of Dr. Morrison's investigation sent shockwaves through the federal bureaucracy that extended far beyond the Department of the Interior's original mandate to investigate post-war violence in Appalachia. The physician's detailed documentation of hereditary cannibalism challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature, criminal behavior, and the role of genetics in determining individual destiny. Government officials found themselves confronting evidence that demanded responses for which no existing policies or precedents provided guidance. Secretary of the Interior Columbus Delano, who received Dr. Morrison's classified report in January 1870, immediately recognized the explosive potential of the findings. The documentation of systematic cannibalism, practiced by an entire mountain community, threatened to confirm the worst stereotypes about Appalachian populations while raising questions about genetic inheritance that could destabilize social and political structures throughout the nation. Dr. Morrison's investigation has uncovered evidence of hereditary behavioral abnormalities that, if genuine, represent threats to public safety and social order that exceed anything we have previously encountered. Secretary Delano wrote in his confidential memorandum to President Ulysses Grant. The implications of inherited cannibalistic compulsions extend far beyond the immediate threat posed by the Holcomb family to encompass broader questions about the genetic foundations of civilized behavior. The political dimensions of Dr. Morrison's findings were particularly troubling to post-Civil War administrators, who were already struggling to maintain social stability in the aftermath of emancipation and Reconstruction. The discovery that certain family lineages carried genetic predispositions to extreme violence threatened to provide scientific justification for racial and social hierarchies that many officials were attempting to establish or maintain. President Grant's response to the Holcomb situation reflected the complex intersection of scientific curiosity, political pragmatism, and moral uncertainty that characterized official attitudes toward genetic research during the 19th century. The President authorized the establishment of a classified research program designed to investigate hereditary behavioral conditions while implementing immediate measures to contain the specific threat posed by the Holcomb family. The newly created Office of Hereditary Investigations, established within the Department of War, under the direction of General Oliver Howard, was tasked with developing comprehensive strategies for identifying, monitoring, and managing individuals and families affected by genetic conditions that pose threats to public safety. The office's first major operation was the systematic relocation and surveillance of the Holcomb clan and their extended network of relatives and allies. The federal intervention in the Holcomb settlement began in March 1870, when a combined force of federal marshals, Army personnel, and medical officers arrived in southwestern Virginia with orders to implement what officials euphemistically termed protective relocation of the affected population. The operation was planned and executed with military precision, designed to minimize resistance, while ensuring that no individuals carrying the hereditary cannibalistic condition could escape surveillance or monitoring. Captain James Mitchell, the Army officer who commanded the relocation operation, documented the extraordinary challenges of dealing with a population that possessed supernatural physical capabilities and predatory instincts that exceeded normal human parameters. His reports describe encounters with transformed Holcomb males who demonstrated strength, speed, and sensory acuity that made conventional restraint methods ineffective and dangerous. The afflicted members of the Holcomb family display physical capabilities that appear to transcend normal human limitations, Captain Mitchell reported. Their strength exceeds that of any men I encountered during my military service, while their ability to track and hunt human prey suggests sensory enhancements that border on the supernatural. Conventional weapons and restraint methods prove inadequate when dealing with individuals who have undergone the hereditary transformation. The military operation required the development of specialized techniques and equipment designed specifically for containing individuals with enhanced physical capabilities and cannibalistic compulsions. The Army engineers constructed portable restraint devices, modified transportation vehicles, and temporary holding facilities that could safely contain subjects who possessed both human intelligence and predatory instincts. The psychological dimensions of the relocation operation proved even more challenging than the physical aspects. Many Holcomb family members who had not yet undergone the hereditary transformation displayed fierce loyalty to their afflicted relatives and actively resisted federal efforts to separate families or relocate individuals. The emotional bonds between normal and transformed family members created complex ethical dilemmas for officials who were attempting to protect public safety while minimizing harm to innocent individuals. Dr. Morrison accompanied the federal relocation team as a medical consultant, responsible for identifying individuals who carried the hereditary condition and assessing the risks posed by various family members. His close observation of the Holcomb community during the intervention process provided additional insights into the social and cultural adaptations that had evolved to accommodate hereditary cannibalism. The Holcomb community has developed sophisticated social structures and cultural practices designed to channel and control the predatory instincts of their afflicted members, Dr. Morrison documented. These adaptations include elaborate hunting protocols, victim selection criteria, and disposal methods that have allowed the community to maintain their cannibalistic activities for generations while avoiding detection by outside authorities. Dr. Morrison's analysis revealed that the Holcomb settlement included individuals who served specialized roles in supporting and managing the activities of transformed family members. These support personnel included scouts who identified potential victims, facilitators who lured targets to isolated locations, and disposal specialists who eliminated evidence and maintained the secrecy that protected the entire community. The systematic nature of these support structures indicated that hereditary cannibalism had evolved from an individual medical condition into a community institution that shaped every aspect of social organization and cultural practice. The transformation of firstborn males was not treated as a disaster or tragedy, but rather as a natural life cycle event that required community adaptation and support. The federal investigation also revealed that the Holcomb community maintained extensive networks with other mountain families who faced similar hereditary challenges. These networks provided mutual support, shared intelligence about potential threats, and coordinated activities to ensure that no single community attracted too much attention from outside authorities. Dr. Sarah Chen, a geneticist who studied Dr. Morrison's classified files in the 1990s, identified evidence suggesting that hereditary cannibalism affected at least 12 distinct family lineages throughout the Appalachian region. These families had maintained contact and cooperation for generations, creating what amounted to a secret society dedicated to concealing and managing inherited behavioral abnormalities. The network of families affected by hereditary cannibalism represents one of the most sophisticated examples of genetic community adaptation ever documented, Dr. Chen concluded. These families developed cultural institutions and social practices that allowed them to accommodate extreme behavioral abnormalities while maintaining functional communities and avoiding detection by mainstream society. The interconnected nature of the cannibalistic families created significant challenges for federal officials who had initially assumed that the Holcomb case represented an isolated phenomenon. The discovery that hereditary cannibalism affected multiple communities throughout the mountains forced authorities to expand their intervention efforts and develop broader strategies for managing genetic threats to public safety. The Office of Hereditary Investigations established monitoring stations throughout Appalachia, staffed by agents who were trained to identify signs of hereditary behavioral abnormalities and track the movements of individuals from affected families. These monitoring efforts were disguised as routine government activities, such as census collection, tax assessment, and public health surveillance, to avoid alerting targeted communities to the true nature of federal interest. The surveillance program documented additional cases of hereditary cannibalism while identifying other genetic conditions that appeared to influence criminal behavior, violence, and social deviance. The accumulated evidence suggested that inherited behavioral abnormalities might be far more common than previously recognized, affecting populations throughout the United States rather than being limited to isolated mountain communities. Dr. Morrison's continued research into hereditary behavioral conditions, conducted under federal auspices, led to the development of classification systems and diagnostic criteria that attempted to distinguish between different types of inherited abnormalities. His work identified several distinct categories of genetic conditions that influenced behavior, ranging from mild predispositions toward aggression to extreme transformations like those documented in the Holcomb family. The research revealed that hereditary cannibalism represented the most severe example of a broader spectrum of genetic conditions that affected impulse control, empathy, and social behavior. Other families demonstrated inherited tendencies toward violence, theft, sexual deviance, and antisocial behavior that, while less extreme than cannibalism, still posed significant challenges for law enforcement and social order. The classification of hereditary behavioral conditions raised complex questions about legal responsibility, medical treatment, and social policy that challenged existing frameworks for understanding crime and punishment. Officials struggled to develop appropriate responses to individuals whose genetic inheritance predisposed them to behaviors that violated social norms and legal standards. The Holcomb case became a foundational example for early discussions about genetic determinism and free will that would influence American social policy for generations. The documentation of inherited cannibalistic compulsions provided apparent scientific evidence for the idea that genetics could override individual choice and moral reasoning, supporting arguments for biological approaches to crime prevention and social control. However, the complexity of the Holcomb situation also revealed the limitations of purely genetic explanations for human behavior. Dr. Morrison's observations documented significant variations in how the hereditary condition manifested among different individuals, suggesting that environmental factors, cultural influences, and individual psychology played important roles in determining behavioral outcomes. The federal government's response to hereditary cannibalism reflected broader tensions between scientific advancement and social stability that characterized late 19th century America. Officials recognized the potential value of genetic research for understanding and preventing criminal behavior, but they also feared that public knowledge of inherited behavioral abnormalities could destabilize social order and promote discrimination against affected populations. The classification and suppression of Dr. Morrison's research ensured that scientific understanding of hereditary behavioral conditions would remain limited for several generations. The failure to pursue open research into genetic influences on behavior meant that affected families continued to suffer without access to medical interventions that might have alleviated their conditions. The long-term consequences of the federal intervention in the Holcomb case included the dispersal of affected families throughout North America and the establishment of surveillance systems that continued to monitor their descendants for over a century. The Office of Hereditary Investigations evolved into various classified government programs that tracked genetic conditions and maintained databases of individuals whose family histories suggested potential behavioral abnormalities. Modern researchers have identified descendants of the original Holcomb family living under assumed names in communities throughout the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Many of these individuals remain unaware of their genetic heritage and the family history that has shaped their lives through generations of secrecy and concealment. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, an anthropologist who has studied displaced Appalachian families, documented the lasting psychological and social effects of the federal intervention on Holcomb descendants. Her research revealed patterns of family dysfunction, identity confusion, and cultural disconnection that persist among individuals whose ancestors were forcibly separated from their mountain communities. The destruction of the Holcomb settlement created intergenerational trauma that continues to affect descendant families more than a century later, Dr. Walsh reported. The loss of cultural identity, family connections, and traditional support systems has left many descendants struggling with problems that their ancestors were able to manage through community cooperation and cultural adaptation. The genetic counseling and monitoring programs established for Holcomb descendants have produced mixed results. with some families benefiting from early intervention while others have been traumatized by genetic surveillance and discrimination. The tension between medical assistance and privacy violation continues to complicate efforts to provide appropriate care for individuals affected by hereditary behavioral conditions. Contemporary medical research has confirmed many of Dr. Morrison's original observations about the genetic basis of the Holcomb condition, while providing new insights into the biological mechanisms underlying inherited behavioral abnormalities. Advanced genetic analysis has identified specific chromosomal markers associated with cannibalistic transformation and developed predictive tests that can identify affected individuals before symptoms appear. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a neurogeneticist who has studied the Holcomb condition, discovered that the hereditary transformation involves fundamental changes in brain chemistry and neural structure that begin during adolescence and culminate in the complete personality alteration documented by Dr. Morrison. These changes appear to be triggered by hormonal fluctuations associated with the 21st birthday, creating a biological clock that determines the precise timing of transformation. The Holcomb condition represents one of the most dramatic examples of genetically programmed behavioral change ever documented in humans, Dr. Rodriguez explains. The transformation involves systematic rewiring of neural pathways that control impulse regulation, empathy, and social behavior, essentially creating a different personality that shares the same body as the original individual. Dr. Rodriguez's research has also revealed that the genetic factors responsible for cannibalistic transformation are linked to enhancements in physical strength, sensory acuity, and cognitive processing that provide significant survival advantages in primitive environments. The condition appears to represent an evolutionary adaptation to extreme survival conditions that becomes maladaptive in civilized social contexts. The evolutionary perspective on hereditary cannibalism has led to increased interest in the condition among researchers studying human adaptation and genetic diversity. Some scientists argue that the Holcomb curse might represent a valuable example of rapid human evolution that could provide insights into the genetic basis of human behavioral flexibility and adaptability. However, the practical challenges of managing hereditary cannibalism in modern society remain significant. The condition continues to manifest in descendant populations with the same timing and severity documented by Dr. Morrison, while effective medical treatments remain elusive despite advances in genetic therapy and neurological intervention. Modern families affected by the Holcomb condition face choices that are remarkably similar to those confronted by their 19th century ancestors. The social stigma associated with hereditary cannibalism makes it virtually impossible for families to seek help through conventional medical channels, while the severity of the condition makes isolation and concealment increasingly difficult in contemporary society. Some affected families have attempted to prevent the hereditary transformation through surgical intervention, hormone therapy, and experimental genetic treatments, but these approaches have proven largely unsuccessful and often dangerous. The biological mechanisms underlying the condition appear to be too fundamental and complex to be easily modified through current medical technology. The development of predictive genetic testing has created new ethical dilemmas for families who know that their children will undergo cannibalistic transformation but lack effective means of prevention. The knowledge that a beloved child will become a monster creates psychological trauma that affects entire family systems and often leads to devastating choices about pregnancy, child-rearing, and family planning. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a descendant of the original investigator who has dedicated her career to studying hereditary behavioral conditions, argues that the Holcomb case demonstrates the need for comprehensive research into genetic influences on behavior that balances scientific advancement with protection of affected individuals and families. The Holcomb condition represents an extreme example of how genetic inheritance can shape human behavior in ways that challenge our understanding of personal responsibility and social justice, Dr. Morrison explains. We need scientific approaches that can help affected families while protecting them from discrimination and persecution based on their genetic heritage. Dr. Morrison's research has documented several promising approaches to managing hereditary cannibalism, including early intervention programs, environmental modifications, and community support systems that help affected families cope with their genetic burden while protecting society from potential dangers. However, the development of effective interventions is complicated by the continued secrecy surrounding hereditary cannibalism and the reluctance of affected families to participate in research programs that might expose their genetic heritage. The legacy of federal persecution and social stigma continues to prevent the open investigation that would be necessary to develop comprehensive medical solutions. The Holcomb case has also influenced contemporary discussions about genetic discrimination, privacy rights, and the appropriate limits of government surveillance of genetic conditions. The historical precedent of federal intervention in genetic matters has created suspicion and resistance among civil rights advocates who fear that genetic research could be used to justify new forms of social control and discrimination. Modern genetic counselors who work with families affected by hereditary behavioral conditions must navigate complex ethical terrain that balances individual autonomy, family welfare, and public safety concerns. The Holcomb case provides both cautionary examples of government overreach and important insights into the genetic basis of extreme behavioral conditions. The legal system continues to struggle with questions about criminal responsibility and appropriate punishment for individuals whose actions are influenced by genetic predispositions. The Holcomb condition represents an extreme test case for legal theories about free will, moral responsibility, and the relationship between biology and behavior that remain unresolved in contemporary jurisprudence. Some legal scholars argue that individuals affected by hereditary cannibalism should be treated as medically ill rather than criminally responsible, while others maintain that genetic predisposition does not eliminate moral accountability for harmful actions. The debate reflects broader tensions about the role of genetics in determining human behavior and the appropriate balance between deterministic and voluntaristic approaches to understanding human action. The Holcomb family's story continues to influence popular culture and public understanding of genetics, heredity, and the nature of evil. The case has inspired numerous fictional works while serving as a reference point for discussions about genetic engineering, human enhancement, and the potential dangers of manipulating human biology. However, the sensationalized portrayal of hereditary cannibalism in popular media has often obscured the serious scientific and ethical questions raised by the actual Holcomb case. The tendency to treat genetic behavioral conditions as entertainment rather than medical reality has contributed to misunderstanding and stigma that affects families dealing with inherited abnormalities. The preservation of Dr. Morrison's research files and the gradual declassification of government documents related to hereditary behavioral conditions have provided researchers with unprecedented access to historical data about genetic influences on human behavior. This information has become increasingly valuable as advances in genetics and neuroscience provide new tools for understanding the biological basis of psychological and behavioral conditions. Contemporary researchers continue to discover new cases of hereditary behavioral abnormalities that share characteristics with the Holcomb condition, suggesting that genetic influences on extreme behavior might be more common than previously recognized. The identification of these cases has led to increased interest in developing comprehensive databases and research networks that could advance understanding while protecting affected individuals and families. The international implications of hereditary behavioral research have also become apparent as researchers identify similar conditions in populations throughout the world. The global distribution of genetic behavioral abnormalities suggests that these conditions represent fundamental aspects of human genetic diversity rather than isolated anomalies affecting specific populations or regions. Dr. Morrison's pioneering investigation of the Holcomb family established the foundation for understanding hereditary cannibalism as a legitimate medical condition that requires scientific investigation and compassionate treatment rather than criminal prosecution or social persecution. His work demonstrated that even the most extreme forms of human behavior might have genetic components that demand medical rather than purely legal responses. The legacy of the Holcomb case continues to challenge researchers, policymakers, and society as a whole to develop more sophisticated approaches to understanding and managing the relationship between genetics and behavior. The family's terrible secret serves as a reminder that human nature is far more complex and variable than conventional assumptions suggest, and that scientific advancement must be balanced with protection of individual rights and dignity. As genetic research continues to advance and our understanding of inherited behavioral conditions expands, the questions raised by Dr. Morrison's investigation of the Holcomb family become increasingly relevant to contemporary discussions about human genetics, medical ethics, and social policy. The case forces us to confront difficult questions about the nature of humanity itself and the extent to which our genetic inheritance shapes our destiny and defines our moral responsibility. The empty mountain hollows where the Holcomb family once concealed their dark secret now serve as reminders of the complex relationship between genetic inheritance and human behavior, while the scattered descendants of that ancient bloodline continue to carry forward the burden of their hereditary curse into an uncertain future where science and compassion must somehow find ways to address the deepest mysteries of human nature and genetic destiny.